King Kong almost didn't get made. Not because the idea was too crazy, though it was, but because the studio behind it, RKO Pictures, was technically no longer a studio. It was a bank. During the Great Depression, the financial situation at the studio had become so bad that creditors had taken over. And for years, it was bankers, not movie moguls, greenlighting films. King Kong was a holdover from an earlier era of creative ambition. A massive, expensive, visionary picture no bank would have approved from scratch. It was a hit. It didn't save them. The bank wasn't going to let that happen again. When they tried to repeat the formula with a rush sequel later that year, they made it for a fraction of the budget. Son of Kong turned a modest profit. Not bad. Not enough. But one of the first films that the studio really pushed the bank to let them make was Flying Down to Rio. It was a comedic romance film, but they wanted to incorporate elements of the backstage musical. And it was that part that made the bank kind of hesitant. Only 6 years after sound had took over Hollywood, audiences were already tired of musicals. But Flying Down to Rio found a new kind of spectacle. It was no King Kong, but the musical set pieces were creative, expensive, and staged in unique locations that no movie had tried before. But that's not why anybody really remembers this film. It's remembered for two side characters who had tremendously joyous chemistry. In the next year, RKO would escalate those two actors into the lead roles of the gay divorcee. And the pairing of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers proved to be box office gold. The studio developed them into one of cinema's most famous on-screen duos. People were willing to see them again and again and again. Ultimately, the star duo of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers would move the musical genre somewhere new entirely. Both characters were often professional performers, and many of the dance and song routines took place as part of a performance. But just as many weren't, because singing and dancing were central to the characters outside of their professions. In the Astaire and Rogers films, the song and dances weren't a break from the story. They were the story. This was the integrated musical. Astaire always played this aloof, dance-obsessed charmer. Early on, he would do this solo number because he's just the kind of guy to do that.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was disturbing you. You see, every once in a while, I suddenly find myself dancing.
And then, of course, he'd run into Ginger Rogers. And of all the women in the world for him to fall in love with at first sight, it just happened to be someone as talented as he was. So the numbers would follow the arc of the couple's relationship. Their first dance together would be this competitive routine where they size each other up.
Maybe you're right. You probably couldn't keep up with me anymore anyway.
Oh, you think not? Well, I'm not so sure you could keep up with me.
And then, a second centerpiece love dance. Part courtship, part consummation. That proves that they belong together even when the plot says they can't be. Followed by a grand finale that erupts into a massive set piece with dozens of extras where the couple resolves the tension. The dances were so good at conveying emotion that across 9 films, Fred and Ginger kissed exactly once. It just wasn't necessary. The dancing was romance enough. For RKO, this became a replicatable formula. So, in between all of the dancing and the romance, the films relied on screwball-style comedy plots. Astaire's character always had a goofball warmth to him. A looseness that makes you smile before you even know why. Even in a tuxedo, on a set that costs more than most houses. There's a bit of vaudeville in everything he does. A little Charlie Chaplin. A little Buster Keaton. Physical comedy disguised as elegance. Rogers matched him. Glamorous and wry in the same breath.
You know, you are a lot more intelligent than you look.
Why, thank you. I wish I could say the same of you. Good night.
Always playing some sharp, hard-nosed woman who's wary of men. And for some contrived reason, she'd always be unable to entertain Astaire's advances, despite the obvious chemistry. But he would always be unalterably happy, affectionate, and in pursuit. He'll race a car next to a reluctant Rogers, or borrow a stranger's dog, just to walk alongside a reluctant Rogers. But his charm would always win her over in the end. These movies were escapist, and proud of it, which makes it all the more remarkable when you learn what was happening behind the camera. Fred Astaire was meticulous, some would say obsessive, about how all of the dancing was captured on film. I mean, he would practice his routines for hours, days, weeks, until he got it right. First, alongside his dance director and co-choreographer, Hermes Pan, and then, once he had it down, Rogers would have to come in and learn it all, but in heels and backwards. No doubt about it, Astaire was a perfectionist. Rehearsals were grueling, 12-hour days, sometimes longer. Years later, he'd remark that of all of his female dancing partners, Rogers was the only one who never cried. He meant it as admiration, but it was also a description of the work. So for all of that effort, it was essential that the audience knew there was no camera trickery. Astaire mandated that the camera capture the dancers' entire bodies, head to toe. He insisted on long, uninterrupted takes. If a mistake happened 3 minutes into a 4-minute routine, they'd start over from the beginning. And the perfectionism didn't stop when filming did. Starting with Roberta, Astaire would go back into the studio after the fact and re-record every tap sound himself, each click precisely synchronized to the final cut. Then, Pan would come in and do the same thing, only in Rogers' shoes. All that ease on screen, the warmth, the spontaneity, the sense that he was simply playing around, was manufactured through relentless effort. The effortlessness was the most effortful thing about it. Though the world those dances lived in mattered just as much. During the Great Depression, Astaire and Rogers' musical served as a tonic for a struggling public, creating a world of impossible luxury. Under RKO's art director, Van Ness Paul-Glaze, who had started his career as an architect, the films featured gleaming Art Deco sets, massive high-gloss floors made of Berkelite that reflected the dancers and enhanced the sense of frictionless movement. But more than anything, it was the color, or rather, the absence of it. Big white sets, an impossibly clean, high-contrast world, black tuxedos against white floors, white gowns against white walls. Even in black and white, these films glowed. I mean, even if Astaire's character was broke, he still wore a tuxedo and moved through a fairyland of luxury hotels and Venetian resorts. And Rogers looked every bit as considered, probably more. She would work closely with the costume designers on these films, and was given real freedom to shape the look of her characters. In Top Hat, she famously fought to wear a feathered dress that Astaire hated. Not because of the style, mind you, but because the feathers kept getting on his suit. Well, she wore it anyway. And the contrast between the gritty reality of the 1930s and those gleaming white sets was itself a kind of spectacle. But I think it's important to note the spectacle of Astaire and Rogers musicals didn't come out of nowhere. It came from vaudeville, and from performers Hollywood was happy to imitate, but rarely willing to center. For cinema, the dominant form of live entertainment in America was vaudeville. Variety shows that toured the country for nearly half a century, mixing comedy, acrobatics, singing, and dance into a single evening's program. It was where performers learned to do everything, because an act that can only do one thing didn't survive.
Now.
Some of the biggest names in silent film had started there. Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, the Marx Brothers, all vaudeville performers before they were filmmakers. But the dancers Astaire admired most were black vaudeville performers whose influence Hollywood could absorb more easily than it could elevate. A major name on the scene was Bill Bojangles Robinson. As a dancer, he was upright, elegant, and precise. Already a legend before Hollywood ever knew quite what to do with him. And there was John W. Bubbles, later called the father of rhythm tap. Where Robinson danced light on his toes, Bubbles dropped his heels, bent the rhythm, and turned tap into something closer to jazz percussion. He didn't just dance to the music, he played it. In 1920, Bubbles gave tap lessons to a young Fred Astaire, which makes swing time complicated. In 1936, for that film, at the height of Astaire's powers, he paid tribute to Robinson in a solo number called Bojangles of Harlem. It incorporated Robinson's signature steps, but rhythmically, the ghost of Bubbles is there too. It was also performed in blackface. Largely, it wasn't controversial in its time. Blackface was still a very common practice, but certainly black audiences themselves would have been uncomfortable regardless of its mainstream appeal. And that contradiction is the early Golden Age musicals in miniature. Black performance shaping the form, while black performers themselves were pushed to the margins. Hollywood could admire the rhythm. It could borrow the steps. It could build an entire genre from the influence. But the safest commercial image was still Fred Astaire in a tuxedo. Or worse, Fred Astaire in blackface. But whatever its blind spots, the formula worked. And I don't just mean artistically. During the worst years of the Depression, audiences didn't just go to an Astaire and Rogers picture to think about what was wrong with the world. They went there to forget. And RKO could count on that. They had found their house style. And for 6 years, it was a success. 9 films, box office gold. But by the end of the decade, the magic was fading. Returns were declining. Carefree was the classic formula, yet overall it felt somewhat diminished. Yes, it has a great early solo number, the contrived chase scene, but the first dance is lackluster and oddly takes place in a dream. The second is a blast, perhaps as spectacular as anything they'd ever put to screen. But the final dance isn't an elaborate set piece. There's no extras, no grand finale. The machine was breaking down. For years, audiences had clamored for one thing the films always withheld. In Carefree, they finally got it. Astaire and Rogers kissed. Wasn't enough. So, for their final RKO film together, Astaire and Rogers attempted something different.
Stop it up there!
All right. We heard you.
The story of Vernon and Irene Castle was a period biopic about real dancers, real history, and a real tragedy. With some of the best set design, costume design, and cinematography of any film they'd ever made. It was a genuine attempt to evolve artistically. But a dramatic story meant that the dancing had to be de-emphasized. No number runs longer than about 2 minutes. None of them approach anything near extravagance, and several get lost in the edit. The very type of film they would have sworn against 5 years earlier. And if that wasn't enough, the film ends with Astaire's character dying and Rogers in tears. Escapist, this was not. It underperformed. And just like that, the partnership was over. Astaire and Rogers went their separate ways. But RKO had survived the depression and paid off their debts. My name is Isaac Emanuel, and this is Genre Pulse.